Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're buzzing into the fascinating world of honeybees.
Sounds great.
You sent in a truly eclectic mix of sources, everything from the hard science of their biology
Yeah.
to some wonderfully imaginative fiction. I mean, even bees with their own religion.
Yeah, quite a range.
Our mission is to get to the heart of what makes honeybees tick, separating the factual buzz from the fictional sting, and hopefully uncovering some real aha moments for you.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic opportunity to explore not just the intricate workings of a bee colony, but also how this incredible social structure has, inspired our own human ways of thinking and storytelling.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with something that sounds a little like happy hour gone wrong.
Hmm.
Fermented honey and intoxicated bees. One of your sources mentioned that under specific rare conditions, honey inside the hive can actually ferment.
Right. And what's interesting is just how delicate those conditions are. It's not common. You need a very specific balance of moisture and, well, temperature. But when it does happen, yeah, the sugars in the honey can indeed break down and produce alcohol.
And the result,
Yeah.
like tipsy bees stumbling around,
Yeah.
the source says they can get disoriented, even paralyzed. That sounds pretty serious for such tiny creatures.
It really is. Because they're so small, even a tiny amount of alcohol can have a, significant effect on their little nervous systems and how they control their bodies.
Wow.
In severe cases, it can unfortunately be fatal for individual bees.
So how do beekeepers prevent their hives from turning into miniature breweries?
Yeah.
Is there anything they can do?
Well, if we connect this to the practical side of beekeeping, the source points to a few key things. Making sure the honey is fully ripened, meaning it has a low enough water content,
All right.
storing it properly, and ensuring good airflow within the hive to keep things dry. Think of it like, preventing dampness in your own home.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Moving on from potential bee cocktails, let's dive into the family dynamics inside the hive. One of the sources clarified that it's a bit more complex than just a big family of siblings.
Yeah, this raises a really important point about how related these bees are and how that might drive their amazing cooperative behavior. The female worker bees are all sisters, yes, and they all share the same queen mother.
Okay.
But what's fascinating is that the queen mates only once in her lifetime, well, during one mating period, but with many different male bees called drones. And she stores their sperm to fertilize eggs as needed, sometimes for years.
Okay, so lots of different fauntlets for all these sister workers.
Yeah.
But what about the male drones we see buzzing around? Where do they fit in the family tree?
Ah, the drones. They have a very different genetic makeup. They are what we call haploid, meaning they only have one set of chromosomes, and they inherit that solely from the queen.
No father.
No father at all. This makes them half-siblings to each other because they share the same mother, but genetically speaking, no father.
So a hive essentially full of super close female relatives and then a bunch of half-brother males. It really makes you wonder how this unique family structure influences their incredible teamwork.
Exactly. The exceptionally high degree of relatedness among the worker bees is thought to be a major factor in why they're so, well, altruistic and cooperative. They're essentially working to ensure the survival of their shared genes passed on by their mother, the queen.
Like they're all pulling together for the benefit of their extended family.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, when these industrious worker sisters head out to find food, it's not just a random flight, right? They're on a mission. How do they know where to go? And more importantly, how do they tell their sisters back at the hive about a great discovery?
What's truly remarkable is their communication system. It's quite sophisticated. They use a combination of these intricate waggle dances and chemical signals called pheromones
The waggle dance, yes.
to share precise information about the location and, crucially, the quality of food sources. The waggle dance, in particular, is like a living GPS system encoded in movement and vibration. It conveys both the direction relative to the sun and the distance to a good patch of flowers.
I always pictured bees just following bright colors and sunshine. But one of the sources said it's more about specific scents, certain colors they can see, including ultraviolet, which is invisible to us, and the shape of the flower. Not just sunlight reflecting off colors.
Precisely. Their vision is specialized. They perceive a different spectrum than we do, including those UV patterns on flowers that act almost like, well, landing strips guiding them in.
Like runway lights for bees?
Kind of. And scent plays a crucial role, too, both in initially attracting them and helping them identify the right kind of flower.
So they're not just randomly buzzing around hoping for the best. They're highly targeted foragers. And when they find nectar, they use that amazing straw-like tongue, their proboscis, right?
Exactly. The proboscis collects the nectar. And while they're doing that, pollen sticks to the hairs all over their bodies, making them nature's tiny, incredibly efficient pollinators.
Right, and that's how plants get pollinated.
That's the crucial exchange. And, contrary to maybe what some people think, they aren't actually telling their sisters about the specific sugar content back at the hive. The waggle dance conveys location and a general sense of quality or abundance, not a detailed chemical analysis.
Ah, okay. That clears that up. So the nectar they collect gets brought back to the hive, and the pollen too. What happens then? Let's talk about this honey and bee bread production line. Sounds like a real team effort.
It is. It's a fantastic example of collaboration. Forager bees return, loaded with nectar and pollen, and they actually pass it on to other worker bees within the hive, the house bees.
A handoff, basically.
Exactly. These house bees then take over the processing. For nectar, they need to reduce its water content. They do this through evaporation, sometimes even fanning it with their wings to speed it up.
Wow.
And they add enzymes from their own bodies. This transforms it into honey, which they then store in those perfect hexagonal cells of the honeycomb.
And the pollen.
Pollen gets mixed with a bit of honey and more enzymes to create what's called bee bread. That's the really protein-rich food source, crucial for feeding the developing larvae, the baby bees.
So honey is for energy, bee bread is for growth.
In simple terms, yes. Honey is the carbohydrate energy store. Bee bread is the protein powerhouse for the young.
Got it. And then there's the whole dramatic affair of the mating ritual. It's not exactly a quiet, private moment, is it?
Not at all. The mating ritual is a critical event for the colony's survival. It happens way up high in specific areas known as drone congregation areas.
Drone congregation areas. Sounds like a singles bar in the sky.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Vast numbers of drones from different hives gather there, essentially competing in this aerial free-for-all for the chance to mate with a virgin queen who flies into the area.
A real high-stakes competition. One source mentioned pushing and shoving amongst the drones in midair.
Indeed. And for the drone who is ultimately successful, well, it's a bittersweet victory, to say the least. The very act of mating is fatal for the drone. His reproductive organ, called the endophilus, detaches during the process, along with some abdominal tissue, and he dies shortly thereafter. It's a single sacrificial act.
Whoa, that's intense. Compared to the queen, who gets to mate with multiple drones during these flights, right? Seems a bit unfair on the poor drones.
Well, from an evolutionary perspective, the queen's multiple matings are crucial. They ensure genetic diversity within the colony. More diverse genes mean a more resilient and adaptable workforce.
So the drone sacrifice serves the greater good of the hive's gene pool.
Precisely. His individual contribution, while fatal, serves that larger purpose of genetic mixing.
Now, how does a new queen even come to be? Does the old queen just pick a successor?
Interestingly, no. All fertilized eggs laid by the queen actually have the potential to develop into queens. It's not predetermined at the egg stage.
So what makes the difference?
It's all about the diet they receive as larvae. If a larva is fed exclusively on royal jelly, this really rich, milky substance produced by worker bees, it will develop into a queen. If it gets the standard bee bread and honey diet, it becomes a worker.
So it's all in the food. The royal diet makes the queen.
That's right. It triggers the developmental pathway to become a reproductive female.
And once a new queen emerges, after her mating flight and all that, it's not exactly a peaceful handover of power, is it? One of the sources mentioned a queen battle to the death. That sounds incredibly dramatic.
It is. It's driven by a powerful instinct. A hive can generally only support one queen, so newly hatched virgin queens have this fierce drive to eliminate any potential rivals.
They hunt each other down.
Yes, they will actively seek out and sting other newly emerged virgin queens. They'll even locate and destroy queen cells containing pupas that haven't hatched yet. It's pretty brutal, but necessary from the hive's perspective to ensure only one queen reigns.
Nature is metal sometimes. Okay, what about the drones after the mating season wraps up? Do they just stick around enjoying the honey the workers collected?
Unfortunately for the drones, their primary role is reproduction. Once the main mating season ends and there's less chance of virgin queens needing to be fertilized, their usefulness to the hive diminishes.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. The worker bees may actually evict the drones from the hive. This is especially true as colder weather approaches and food becomes scarcer. It's about conserving precious resources.
Eviction. That sounds pretty harsh. How exactly do they kick them out? Do they just ask nicely?
Not quite. The worker bees will collectively harass the drones, pushing them, biting at their wings or legs, sometimes even attempting to sting them to force them out of the hive. It's a group effort.
And the drones can't fight back.
Well, it's important to remember that the male drones themselves lack stingers. They have no real way to defend themselves against the workers' actions.
Man, rough deal for the drones post-summer. It really highlights the starkly different roles and the survival priorities within the hive.
Absolutely. Everything serves the colony's overall health and continuation.
Staying on the subject of stings, we all know the common understanding. A worker bee stings you, it dies.
Yes, that's generally true for mammals like us. The worker bee's stinger is barbed, like a little fishhook. It gets lodged in our thicker, more elastic skin.
And when the bee flies away,
The stinger, along with the venom sac and parts of its digestive tract and nerves, are torn away from its abdomen. This massive injury is fatal to the bee. It's an ultimate act of defense for the colony.
but one of the sources mentioned something surprising, that this isn't always the case, depending on who or what they sting.
That's right. It's not a universal outcome. In animals with thinner skin or exoskeletons, think other insects, maybe some spiders, or even potentially small mammals like mice or certain birds, the stinger might not become as deeply embedded.
So they might be able to pull it out.
Potentially, yes. If the bobs don't anchor firmly, the bee might be able to retract the stinger intact and survive the encounter. So stinging doesn't automatically mean death for the worker bee.
And apparently, bee stings are generally not fatal for these smaller animals either. It's more of a painful deterrent.
Exactly. The amount of venom is usually not enough to be lethal for creatures of that size. It's meant to warn them off, protect the hive.
Okay, let's circle back quickly to that fermented honey. The source mentioned it can lead to intoxicated bees. We talked about disorientation, but what are the wider consequences for the hive?
Well, beyond just a few wobbly individuals, the source also suggests that worker bees might actively remove these intoxicated bees from the hive.
Like bouncers at the hive entrance?
Sort of. It's likely a way to maintain order and efficiency. You can't have intoxicated bees bumping into things or failing at their jobs. It could disrupt the colony's essential activities.
Makes sense. And what about the drones and fermented honey? Do they ever get into trouble with it?
Interestingly, the source indicated that drones are less likely to become significantly intoxicated. Maybe it's their diet, maybe their behavior within the hive. It's not entirely clear why.
So no aggressive drunk drones picking fights.
Doesn't seem like it. Even if they did ingest some, they don't tend to exhibit that kind of aggressive behavior sometimes associated with intoxication in other animals.
Good to know. Finally, on honeybee biology and behavior, let's just get clear on the different diets within the hive. It's not a one-size-fits-all buffet, is it?
Absolutely not. Very distinct diets depending on the bee's caste and life stage. Queen larvae, as we said, get that exclusive royal jelly diet, crucial for their development.
Right, the royal treatment.
Adult queens primarily consume honey and nectar for energy, though they may still get some royal jelly supplements from attendant workers. Worker larvae start on royal jelly for a very short time, then switch to bee bread, that protein pollen mix.
And adult workers.
Adult workers need both. Their diet consists of bee bread for protein and tissue maintenance, and honey or nectar for the high energy demands of foraging, building, nursing, and defending.
And the drones, just honey.
Pretty much. Drones mainly consume honey as adults for flight energy. They don't typically eat bee bread or royal jelly once they've matured. Their needs are simpler, focused on that mating role.
Okay, that gives us a really solid picture of the biology and behavior. Now let's shift gears and delve into some of the more metaphorical and creatively interpreted aspects that popped up in your sources. This is where it gets weird and wonderful. One source even envisioned a whole new religion based on honeybee life.
Yeah, here's where things get really interesting, seeing how that incredibly intricate social structure of a bee colony gets viewed through a human lens. The source material presented this idea of the single reproductive female, the queen, a workforce of effectively sterile female workers, and this population of male drones whose main purpose is reproduction. Well, it offers a powerful, though maybe simplified, parallel to aspects of human society.
The source specifically highlighted the imagery of a single mother, sworn virgin sisters, and a hive of half-brothers. That's quite a framework for a belief system.
It is, and it definitely makes you think, as the source itself touched upon, about the potential interpretations regarding gender roles and societal expectations. We're just reporting what the source suggested here, not endorsing any viewpoint, of course.
Right, absolutely. It's just fascinating how a natural phenomenon can spark such imaginative and potentially loaded ideas.
Precisely. The way we metaphorically apply the honeybee model can reflect and maybe even influence our own understanding of social structures. It really underscores our human tendency to find meaning and patterns in the natural world and connect them back to our own lives.
Then we encountered some wonderfully imaginative anthropomorphic bee narratives. Bees with, like, human-like emotions and individual perspectives on their own life cycle.
Yeah, these fictional glimpses really bring the honeybee world to life in a unique way, imagining a loyal worker bee feeling maybe a bit resentful toward the drones just hanging around.
Or a vain young queen totally focused on her upcoming mating flight.
Or even a drone seeing his final act not as just death, but as some kind of noble sacrifice for the hive. It lets us connect with their biology on a more emotional, kind of relatable level, even if it's fiction.
And the idea of worker bees in a coffee house, interpreting the waggle dance as a news report and then making this pledge of solidarity to the sisterhood that was quite a vivid scene. It really plays with the complexity of their communication.
It does, and it highlights that incredible level of cooperation and shared purpose that exists within a real bee colony, even when we're imagining it through a human-like narrative.
Now, some of the sources touched on some truly unusual bee abilities, or rather, things they definitely cannot do. For instance, the idea of drones somehow converting honey into limestone.
Okay, yeah. This is where we need to gently steer away from the purely fantastical and back to biological reality.
Wow.
While bees do interact with minerals, the notion of drones having the biological machinery to convert honey, which is mostly sugars, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, into limestone, which is calcium carbonate.
Doesn't add up.
It simply isn't grounded in science. They lack the necessary biochemical pathways, the whole physiological setup for such a transformation.
It reminded me of the point that insects generally don't extract calcium from bones, except for those specialized dermestid beetles we talked about once, and even they are after the organic stuff mainly.
Exactly. Insect calcium use varies. Butterflies and moths need it for wings and eggs. Aquatic insects get it from the water. But yeah, extracting calcium from bone isn't a typical insect thing.
And the waggle dance, apparently, one source floated the idea it might be a form of drone arousal. That seems completely off base from everything we know.
That's a clear misunderstanding, yeah. As we've discussed, the waggle dance is a highly evolved communication tool. It's for conveying specific information about food sources, direction, distance, quality. Attributing a reproductive arousal purpose to it for drones just isn't supported by any scientific observation of bee behavior.
Then there was the Mosquito Girls radical movement within a fictional hive wanting to confine queens and switch to a diet of blood. That sounds, well, not very bee-like at all.
Indeed. That narrative concept is like the polar opposite of the fundamental biological and social principles of a honeybee hive. It relies entirely on the queen's reproduction, the drone's role, and that nectar pollen diet. Blood feeding and forced egg laying, completely alien to their nature.
Okay, another specific point. Workers stinging drones. Does it always result in the worker's death? Apparently, the drone's tougher exoskeleton might make a difference.
That's a more nuanced point, actually. While a worker bee's barbed stinger embeds effectively in our softer skin, the exoskeleton of another insect, like a drone, is considerably harder.
So the barbs might not catch.
They might not penetrate as deeply or become as firmly lodged, yeah. This could potentially allow the worker to retract her stinger with a slightly higher chance of survival compared to stinging a mammal. But stinging is still inherently risky for her, regardless of the target.
Good clarification. And no, despite any wild fictional theories, drinking energy drinks won't lead to caffeinated honey. That was a fun one.
Biologically speaking, that's highly improbable. The whole nectar-to-honey process involves enzymes and evaporation. It doesn't just incorporate caffeine directly like that.
There was also the rather poignant image from one source of an old queen leaving the hive to try and start a new colony all by herself and ultimately failing. That really underscores how vital the worker bees are.
It does. A queen, despite her crucial reproductive role, is incredibly reliant on the support and tireless efforts of thousands of worker bees to successfully establish and maintain a colony. Foraging, building combs, feeding larvae, defense. She can't do any of that alone. Her chances of survival and success solo are extremely slim.
Right. Now, let's tackle something a bit more scientific, but still bordering on the fantastical. The idea of turning honey into diamonds. Can we really transform that sweet, golden liquid into precious gems?
Okay, chemically speaking, let's break it down. Honey is primarily sugars, glucose, and fructose. Those are carbon-based compounds, yes, but they also contain hydrogen and oxygen. Diamonds, on the other hand, are pure carbon atoms arranged in a very specific, rigid crystal lattice structure.
And they need extreme conditions to form, right?
Immense pressure and extremely high temperatures. Conditions found deep within the earth or replicated in specialized labs. A direct, natural conversion of honey to diamond within a beehive or anywhere near the Earth's surface normally. It's simply impossible. The conditions are wildly different.
But could we theoretically achieve this in a lab, like using honey as the carbon source? The source you shared touched on this possibility.
Hypothetically, yes. If you were to extract and purify the carbon from honey, get rid of the hydrogen and oxygen, and then subject that pure carbon to the extreme high-pressure, high-temperature HPHT conditions used for synthetic diamond creation.
Like how they make industrial diamonds now.
Exactly. Similar to processes using graphite or other carbon sources. Then, in theory, you could grow synthetic diamonds originating from the carbon in honey. It would involve complex industrial steps: carbon extraction, purification, the HPHT transformation, controlled crystal growth, and then cutting and polishing.
So technically possible with a lot of industrial intervention, but not a natural bee process.
Not even close. It's a very, very far cry from a bee magically producing a sparkling gem from nectar.
Right. So the notion mentioned in one source of diamond drones, building entire hives out of honey-derived diamonds. Definitely pure fantasy.
Absolutely. That belongs firmly in the realm of science fiction or, well, imaginative storytelling.
We also had a brief but interesting comparison between honeybees and yellow jackets and their respective mating rituals. Apparently quite a stark contrast.
Yeah, the source you provided described the yellow jacket mating ritual as being, let's say, relatively crude and somewhat disorganized compared to the more structured, maybe aerial ballet of the honeybee mating flight. It seems to lack the same level of coordination or specific congregation areas.
So if a honeybee drone somehow wandered into the middle of a yellow jacket mating free-for-all, it wouldn't exactly be welcomed.
Oh, highly unlikely. Given the generally aggressive and territorial nature of yellow jackets, especially around their nests or mating sites, both the worker yellow jackets and probably their own drones would likely perceive the honeybee drone as an intruder.
And attack it.
Almost certainly. It would likely be a very hostile encounter for the poor, lost drone.
Okay. Moving back to honeybees themselves, let's talk about some of the evolutionary adaptations that make them so suited for their roles. The source mentioned worker bees have a retooled female reproductive system. What exactly does that mean?
It refers to the fact that while worker bees are genetically female, their reproductive organs, specifically their ovaries, are typically undeveloped and non-functional for laying fertilized eggs. Their physiology has evolved over millions of years to prioritize the tasks essential for the colony's survival.
Like foraging, building, nursing.
Exactly. Foraging for food, secreting wax and building combs, feeding the larvae, regulating hive temperature, defending the colony, all those critical jobs. They are, in essence, reproductively suppressed, allowing the queen to be the primary, highly efficient egg layer.
And the stinger itself, that's actually an evolved ovipositor, the egg-laying organ of their ancestors, right? Not just bees, but wasps and ants too.
That's a key insight into their evolution, yes. The stinger found in female Hymenoptera, that's the order including wasps, bees, and ants, is indeed a modified ovipositor. Over time, this tube originally used for placing eggs was adapted primarily for defense or, in some wasps, for paralyzing prey.
And the venom? Was that part of the original organ?
Interestingly, the venom itself evolved separately. It wasn't just, retooled eggs that became venomous. Specialized glands developed to produce the complex chemical cocktail we know as venom, delivered through the modified ovipositor.
Fascinating. We even got a little glimpse into subatomic chemistry, with the explanation of how glucose in honey can be converted to ethanol during that rare fermentation process. Electrons rearranging and all that.
Exactly. Fermentation, at its core, is a biochemical process. Microorganisms like yeasts break down glucose first into pyruvate and then further into ethanol and carbon dioxide. This involves a series of enzymatic reactions that literally rearrange the electrons and break and form chemical bonds within the molecules. Very much so. And the Calvin cycle, which was mentioned briefly in the context of plants making glucose from CO2, is essentially the reverse process, using energy, usually from sunlight, to build those sugar molecules up from simpler components.
Okay, almost wrapping up the oddities and details. We touched on some interesting genetic anomalies like the occurrence of diploid drones with 2 sets of chromosomes instead of 1. Is that a sign of unhealthy inbreeding?
The source clarified that diploid drones are generally considered a genetic anomaly, often resulting from a specific genetic mechanism related to sex determination in bees, rather than being solely a direct result of simple inbreeding, though inbreeding can increase the frequency of the alleles involved. It's a bit complex.
And how does the hive treat them? Does the queen attack them like rival queens?
Intriguingly, no, queens don't usually attack diploid drones. Instead, the worker bees often recognize them as abnormal very early on, sometimes even eating the diploid larvae. If they do mature, they're often sterile and generally marginalized within the hive. They don't fulfill the normal drone role.
Okay. And the somewhat crude term dickless wonders, sometimes used for drones, just to clarify, that's only technically accurate after they've performed their single fatal mating act and lost their Endophyllus, right?
Correct. Drones possess their reproductive organs, the Endophyllus, until that one and only mating flight. The act of mating causes it to avert and detach, which is fatal.
And they certainly don't regrow it for another try.
Definitely not. There's no regeneration of that particular organ. One flight, one chance.
It's also fascinating to learn, as one source noted, that even some wild, non-domesticated bee species produce honey. It's not just our familiar Apis mellifera.
Yes, that's true. Various solitary and social bee species around the world, like stingless bees in the tropics, for example, do produce and store honey, though typically in much smaller quantities than commercially managed honeybees. It's primarily for the needs of their own smaller colonies or offspring.
And lastly, the idea of worker bees laying eggs. That's not the normal situation in a healthy hive with a queen, but it can happen.
Yes, it's a phenomenon called laying workers. If the queen is absent for a prolonged period, or if her pheromone signals weaken significantly, the reproductive suppression on some worker bees can lift, and their rudimentary ovaries might start producing eggs.
But these eggs can only become drones, right?
Precisely. Because the workers haven't mated, their eggs are unfertilized, and in bees, unfertilized eggs develop into males, drones. So a hive with only laying workers can produce drones, but no new workers or queens. It's essentially a sign of a failing colony, a kind of last gasp effort to pass on some genes, but it's ultimately unsustainable without a proper queen.
Wow, okay, we have truly taken a deep, deep dive into the world of honeybees today. From the nitty-gritty of their social lives and biology to some seriously imaginative interpretations. What would you say are some of the most significant takeaways from this incredibly diverse collection of sources you shared?
Gosh, where to start? I think firstly, the sheer level of complexity and efficiency within a honeybee colony is just truly astonishing. Their intricate social structure, their sophisticated communication, the waggle dance, the clear division of labor. It's all a remarkable example of evolutionary adaptation.
Absolutely.
Secondly, those seemingly self-sacrificial behaviors, especially the worker bee's stinging response when defending against mammals, really highlight the powerful instinct for colony survival over individual survival. It's fundamental to their existence.
Yeah, that really stands out.
And thirdly, I think it's important to remember that while the life of a honeybee colony provides such a rich source of metaphors for us to explore human society, like that religion idea or the anthropomorphic stories, it's essential we maintain a clear distinction between the biological reality of the bees and our own, human interpretations and projections onto them.
Definitely. There were certainly some surprising facts that really stuck with me. The queen's single multi-partner mating flight, that intense queen battle to the death. And the fact that a bee sting doesn't always mean the end for the bee, depending on what it stings.
Exactly. Those details really challenge common assumptions. And the complexity of the waggle dance, the unique sensory world of bees seeing UV light, the specialized diets, it all contributes to this picture of a highly specialized and deeply interconnected society.
This deep dive has certainly catered to a wide range of curiosities, from the hardcore science to the speculative fiction. It really highlights just how much there is to learn and ponder about these tiny yet incredibly important creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, our listener, as you maybe think about this intricate hive, this delicate balance, the seemingly selfless actions of individual bees for the collective, what parallels or perhaps significant differences do you see in human societies? Is there something maybe we can learn from their unwavering dedication to the common good, even if it's driven purely by instinct?
That's a fascinating question to contemplate, isn't it? And of course, we encourage you to continue exploring any of these bee topics that have sparked your interest. If you have further questions or maybe other areas you'd like us to delve into in future deep dives, please do let us know.
Okay, so, we love it when you send in your thoughts and sources.
Yeah.
And this time you've sent us some amazing stuff.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, YouTube transcript all about the interstate highway system,
Yeah.
its history and impact. And then also like your own personal reflections on gentrification,
Yeah.
which is really cool.
Yeah.
And specifically in Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that we're going to kind of like explore how those two seemingly different things have actually shaped American society
Yeah.
in ways that are much deeper than we might think, especially when we think about like race and class.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that you've got these sources that you've provided really challenge those very straightforward understandings of infrastructure and how cities change.
Right.
And so I think our mission today is to kind of unpack the connections between those projects.
Yeah.
From these huge highway systems down to like what's happening in neighborhoods when they redevelop.
Right.
And to think about those impacts, particularly through race and class.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think we should say up front, we're gonna explore two main areas.
Yeah.
Like we're gonna trace the history and the far-reaching consequences of, the American interstate highway system.
Right.
And then we're going to dig into the complexities of gentrification, and we're going to draw heavily on your experiences in Columbus.
Yeah.
And I think even if people, listening think they're familiar with these topics, I think, what you've sent us is going to reveal some real aha moments.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think jumping right in, one of the things that a lot of people probably think they know is that those long, straight stretches of interstates were designed to be emergency landing strips for airplanes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like one of those things.
It's in a war or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting because the RoboState transcript that you sent actually tackles this.
Okay.
And sort of debunks this widespread belief.
Interesting, because I've heard that for years, I've heard that the interstates were intentionally built with those long, straight sections so planes could land on them.
Right.
Especially, in times of war, like it sounded like, a Cold War thing, like some smart planning.
Yeah.
But you're saying that's not really how it happened.
Not really. And it's interesting because while national defense was definitely a factor
Okay.
in the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, which is why they called it that,
Yeah.
those straight sections that you see weren't really designed specifically for aircraft to land.
Ooh.
So, like, it's much more about geography,
Yeah.
following existing routes and the cost of construction, and also just how those roads would fit into urban planning at the time.
So, like any stretch of interstate that looks like it could land a plane, it was really just by chance. It wasn't like they were deliberately engineered to do that.
Right. And the transcript even points out that this myth may have actually come about because people compare it to things like, in other countries like Germany, where they actually did adapt parts of the Autobahn for military landings.
Oh, interesting.
And while the U.S. military has thought about using highways for emergency landings,
Right.
that was really an afterthought.
Right.
It wasn't part of the original design.
It's kind of like that example they gave in the transcript about like red stop signs used to be yellow.
Right.
Like you just assume,
Yeah.
that that's the way it's always been. But it's like, wow.
Right. How much do we just accept
Yeah.
as fact that maybe isn't?
Yeah, it makes you really wonder. All right, so moving on then, let's get to like a deeper connection that you brought up.
Yeah.
The sources really highlight, and that's almost like the simultaneous arrival of the Civil Rights Movement and the Interstate Highway Act.
Right.
Particularly like in the context of, what became known as like white flight.
Yeah.
What jumps out at you about that link?
Well, I think one of the things that's really striking is how the Montgomery bus boycott, back in the mid-50s, really exposed just how segregated public transportation was,
Right.
And white ridership plummeted.
Yeah.
And then almost at the same time, you have this, this network of interstate highways that start to make it much, much easier to move out of the city centers.
Right.
And it's hard not to see those two things as connected.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like a pretty powerful combination and one that had like huge consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the boycott really revealed that racial divide in public transit. I mean, and for a lot of white people, owning a car became a symbol of independence, like privacy and a way to move away from what they perceived as these changing demographics in the cities.
Right.
And the interstate literally paved the way for that, for white flight, to these expanding suburbs.
Yeah.
So really, like what we're seeing here is that infrastructure wasn't just about moving goods and people,
Yeah.
but also about reshaping the racial landscape of American cities.
And the transcript doesn't shy away from like the more troubling aspects of all of that.
Right.
It points out that these interstates were often built right through established black neighborhoods.
Yeah.
In cities like, Detroit, New Orleans,
Right.
Atlanta.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
it wasn't just about connecting cities. It was about reshaping them,
Right.
often at the expense of minority communities.
And that's a crucial point. And I think what's so powerful is the transcript even quotes James Baldwin,
Oh, wow.
who used the term the Negro Removal Program
Wow.
to describe the impact of these projects
Yeah.
on Black communities.
That's powerful.
Right. And that's the thing. It's like it wasn't just an unintended consequence,
Right.
This was, in many cases, a direct result of, planners who were prioritizing
Right.
white populations over Black residents.
This kind of leads perfectly into what the transcript calls the 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
This idea that both the interstates and like the welfare system actually created different kinds of dependence
Right.
on the government.
Well, in the government.
Can you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah. And I think what's so insightful is the way the transcript links those two systems,
Right.
Because on one hand, you've got the middle class who are largely white, and they became really dependent on government-funded roads and as this entire car infrastructure.
Right. Like you have to have a car.
Yeah, owning a car became essential for everything, for jobs, for schools, for really participating in suburban life.
But that comes with, strings attached, right?
Of course.
Car payments, insurance, gas, all that.
Absolutely. It creates a dependence on debt and the oil industry.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you have the lower classes who are often excluded from those suburban opportunities.
Right.
And because they didn't have access to good public transportation, they became more dependent on government welfare programs.
Right.
Just for basic needs.
Okay, so the point here is that these two systems, highways and welfare, that seem totally separate,
Yeah.
actually created these interconnected forms of dependence
Yeah.
that really reinforce these social divides.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. You think about like this post-war American dream, this image of independence and mobility.
The freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is that was largely an illusion
Yeah.
because that autonomy was always tied to the state in some way,
Interesting.
whether it was through, debt for the middle class or bureaucratic oversight for those relying on welfare.
That's a really fascinating point. Like, it makes you think about infrastructure like roads and things
Yeah.
as something that we take for granted, but it can have like such a huge impact
Right.
on, social and political structures.
Yeah. It structures our lives in ways that we don't even always realize.
Yeah. Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about gentrification
Okay.
and your personal experiences with it in Columbus.
Yeah.
The transcript that we have actually calls Columbus the birthplace of American-style gentrification,
It does.
which is like a pretty bold claim.
Yeah, it is. And, I've lived in Columbus for a long time, and I've seen these changes firsthand.
Right.
And, the transcript mentions some key neighborhoods. German Village, the Short North Franklin, also known as the Bottoms, and Old Town East, which was the focus of that film, Flag Wars.
Right. Right.
And, each of those areas has its own story.
Right. And your perspective, and it comes out in the transcript, is that you feel like gentrification often gets like a really bad rap.
I do.
Like it's portrayed negatively when maybe it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And you seem to see it as something that can actually expose poverty rather than creating it.
Yeah.
And can even offer a pathway out
Yeah.
for some residents.
For some residents, yeah.
Can you kind of walk us through like the core of that argument?
Yeah, I think there's this tendency when people argue against, any kind of change in lower income neighborhoods to sort of romanticize poverty.
Oh.
And to me, it seems morally questionable to want to keep neighborhoods in decline simply because poor people live there.
Okay.
It's like it's almost better to think about offering people real opportunities
Right.
to move out of those situations.
Okay, so you're saying that like transforming these rundown neighborhoods,
Yeah.
into, would essentially become more affluent areas, which is gentrification.
Right.
You're saying that that's ultimately like a positive thing, even if it means that some people get displaced.
I do. I think the transcript really captures that. And I think it's better to focus on, giving people ways to improve their lives,
Right.
through education and job training programs, even relocation assistance,
Yeah.
rather than just trying to preserve what are basically pockets of poverty.
Right, but then that's where all the counter arguments come in.
Right.
Oh, of course.
The criticisms of gentrification are significant and important to consider.
Yeah, like what are some of the main ones that the transcript brings up?
Yeah.
Like what are people concerned about?
Well, the biggest one is displacement. As wealthier people move into an area, rents and property taxes go up,
Right.
and long-term residents often can't afford to stay.
Yeah.
There's also a concern about losing the cultural identity of these neighborhoods, especially if it's a historically Black neighborhood or an immigrant community.
Right.
And the transcript also points out that a lot of this redevelopment happens without really involving the people who already live there.
Right. They don't have much say.
Exactly. They don't have much say. And the point the transcript makes is that not gentrifying, like the opposite of gentrification isn't a neutral position either.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a form of institutionalized neglect.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that sometimes the way systems or policies are set up can unintentionally lead to certain areas just not getting the investment or care that they need.
Oh, okay.
So it's like you can't just say, well, we're not going to gentrify and think that's somehow helping.
Right.
Because it might be leading to a different set of problems.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then the Columbus situation is interesting because it's, as your sources point out, like a lot of the early gentrifications, especially in German Village, was really driven by private investment.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't like a big government initiative
Right.
or big corporations coming in.
Right. It was individuals and small businesses putting their money in.
Okay. And what were some of the positive outcomes of that?
Well, the area was revitalized economically.
Oh.
Tourism increased, property values went up, and there was this real sense of civic pride in that revitalized neighborhood.
But it still brings up that question of, who benefits and who gets pushed out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads to this concept of a moral middle ground.
Right.
That the transcript talks about this idea of gentrification with justice.
So what would that look like?
Well, it means finding ways to redevelop and invest in these struggling neighborhoods without erasing their history and without causing widespread displacement. So it's about recognizing that, just letting these areas decline isn't a good solution. But it also means being really intentional about making sure that the people who live there now can benefit from those improvements.
Okay.
So like the transcript suggests maybe there are ways for long-term residents to actually own property in their communities.
Right.
Or portable housing vouchers that aren't tied to one specific location, things like that.
Okay.
Could shift the conversation away from just being against gentrification and towards being more proactive about making sure that everyone has access to good housing and vibrant neighborhoods. My motivation, and I think the transcript picks up on this, is not about being anti-poor.
Right.
It's about being anti-perpetuation of poverty. It's about, striving for progress and better living conditions for everyone.
I love that distinction.
Yeah.
That's really, really important.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really incredible how these two seemingly separate issues, the construction of the interstates and the process of gentrification are actually like deeply connected, in shaping American cities and really our society as a whole.
Absolutely. And I think what we've seen is that, the interstates weren't just about transportation.
Yeah.
They played a role in, racial segregation. They created, different patterns of dependence. And then, your experiences in Columbus with gentrification really challenge us to think beyond just the negatives.
Right.
And to consider all these complicated moral questions about, urban change and poverty.
Yeah, and it really does make you realize that even something like a highway, that seems so simple, has a long history and like this huge impact, that goes way beyond its original purpose.
Right.
And also that like some of the things we think are facts, like the landing strip thing,
Exactly.
aren't always true.
Yeah, you got to question what you think, because it might not be the whole story.
Yeah, exactly. And then, your perspective on gentrification really drives home the fact that these aren't like theoretical debates.
Right.
They're real life situations with real consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. These are people's lives we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. This has been like a super insightful conversation.
Yeah.
And it really makes me think about that suggestion from the transcript about maybe exploring your perspective on gentrification even more.
Yeah.
In a bigger way.
Yeah, that's something to think about.
Yeah, maybe like an op-ed or something.
Yeah.
But for you listening, it begs the question, like, how are these historical processes still shaping the communities where you live?
Yeah.
What are those forces that maybe we don't always see?
Right.
that are at play in the development of our cities. And then also, what can we do as individuals, and what can policy do to try to create these more, equitable and thriving urban environments. So like maybe take some time to look into the history of your own city,
Yeah.
or find out about local initiatives that are trying to address like affordability and community development.
Yeah. There's always more to learn.
Yeah, there's always more to learn.
When you dig a little deeper.
Yeah, when you take a deep dive.
Exactly.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll see you next time.